Hi, my name is Ivy. Welcome to Open Space. Again, the perspective of white people regarding Black Lives Matter. Who wants to start introducing themselves?
I'm Dan. I am born and raised in London. I have a very mixed family. So my dad comes from a Spanish Moroccan background, more Spanish, but he was born and raised in Morocco. He was an asylum seeker here when he was 16. And then my mum's Portuguese. She came here to get away from the issues that there were in Portugal as well.
Okay. What do you want to gain from this conversation?
Just the perspective really of what how other people are feeling, what their ideas and thoughts are around this, and good to kind of see. Well, it's a little bit confusing because the majority of people I tend to be speaking to about it aren't white. So it's very few people that are white that I'm talking to about the issues that are taking place. So it'll be good to get a perspective of how other people kind of see it and what their experiences are towards it.
Yeah, hi guys, I'm Shelby. I'm from San Diego, California. I was born and raised here, and I went traveling for a few years, and now I run a sustainable travel blog, which my focus is reconstructing travel behaviors. So Ivy actually found me on a post about talking about white privilege within travel. And then she asked me if I want to be part of this conversation. I thought it was kind of like divine intervention because I was just thinking about how white privilege and racism intersects in different countries and what that means, and if we're experiencing the same thing here as if people are experiencing in England or Germany or any really Western nation, how racism differs and people's experiences differ. So I'm super happy to be here. Thanks for putting this on, Ivy.
Hi, my name is Patrick. I am from Germany. I live in Munich. I actually don't have any German roots. My parents are both from Yugoslavia. My father is from Slovenia and my mother is from Croatia. I'm basically have never experienced any negative impact because of my heritage. No one ever mentioned anything about it. Also, when I tell people I'm not German, they are on one hand surprised and on the other hand, where are you then from? And when I say Slovenia, they're like, okay, where is that exactly? So I never experienced anything negative where my roots are involved.
What do you want to gain from this conversation?
I just want to hear other people's opinions because now with Black Lives Matter and also even a little before Black Lives Matter, I try to educate myself about this topic, listen to many podcasts and also read books about it. I'm really into politics and try to understand how certain issues, like where the reason for certain issue lie. And it's always interesting to hear other people talk about the topics I'm currently trying to inform myself about right now.
I'm Sam. I'm a musician working in London. My background is my father is English as far back as we know. My mother is Jewish. Her father was Slovenian Jew who ended up in Cape Town, and grandmother was a German Jew escaping the Nazis in the 40s, ended up in Cape Town, and then they met there, and then he was involved in the Communist Party in Cape Town, which ended up working with the ANC, and he ended up being tried for treason along with Mandela and a bunch of other people. They then had to escape from there, ended up in London. That's kind of my background.
I'm Ashlee. I am living currently in San Francisco, California, originally from Los Angeles. My family is just all white Americans. My family is all extremely racist. All of her children, though, are very far left, liberal, intersectional, feminist, all that kind of stuff. So it hasn't passed down or anything like that. And my dad is very far left as well. From the conversation, I hope to gain just more insight. I know friends that I have that are from Europe don't often talk about things like this. And then I read the book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And that goes into everything in the UK and different parts of Europe and all of these things. And I found that very insightful. So very excited.
My name's Emma. I was born in England, but I've lived in Germany for the past 25 years. I'll be the first person to admit that my political knowledge isn't great. It definitely could be better. So I'm actually here to discuss people's opinions, and I definitely want to learn a lot more about it.
Okay, thank you. Rudi.
So I grew up in Newcastle, moved to London about 8 years ago or something now, just to do music. And then my family on my mum's side is like Geordie through and through. My dad's like born Jewish, but he doesn't know anything about where his parents have like come from or stuff. Just knows that they like worked on like a ghost train. Yeah, I guess I'm fairly new to the conversation. So like I'm just eager to learn and like hear other people's ideas and like how to move forward. And
Sofia.
Hi, I live in Los Angeles, born and raised here. I am half white on my mom's side and half Palestinian on my dad's side. And he is a refugee. He lived in Kuwait and then Jordan, and then he fought in the Lebanese Civil War. And then he went to fight for the PLO, and his mom was pretty sure he was going to die. So she brought him to the United States and left him here with his aunt. So that's how my family ended up in the US. But because of the fact that, you know, my dad grew up as a refugee and fighting in wars and stuff like that, we've always talked about this kind of stuff. I mean, every night at the dinner table was a political talk, and people will come to my house and be like, these people are crazy. So I've been having these conversations for a really long time, and I don't really have them with white people. So this is kind of different for me. So I'm excited to just kind of get the perspective of other white people, because most of the people I talk to about it are my Middle Eastern family or like my Black and Hispanic friends. And I also am excited to see kind of how other countries feel about it, because I feel like things in the United States are always so extreme. And maybe that's just because I'm ignorant to what's happening in other countries, but I feel like it's just a lot of extremes here. And I'd be interested to see if it is in other places as well.
Hey, yeah, I'm Hillary. I was born and raised in San Diego. I just moved up to Long Beach about a year ago, so just outside of LA, for those who don't know. I was born into a family that lacked a lot of knowledge about what goes on in the world, and that's actually very much so voluntary on their part. They didn't like to pay attention to what was going on. It was very much so a little bubble. But we were raised to welcome and love anybody who entered our family or entered our friends group. So it was kind of an interesting dynamic. But as I grew up, I really hated ignorance, and I didn't like that they voluntarily excluded themselves from conversations that were important. And as I tried to have conversations with my family, they would just kind of pretend to care and then brush it off and not really participate. So I started traveling really young and traveled to a few places and tried to learn about cultures when I could, and kind of help where I could, and came home and talked to a lot of my friends about what I saw and how we could change our behaviors here. That kind of tumbled it very, very slowly into the rest of my life. And so this conversation means a lot to me, but I have a hard time finding, at least before now, I had a hard time finding people who actually would devote themselves to difficult conversations and take the energy and the emotion to do that. And a lot of white people are very much so. It doesn't happen to me, so it's not a problem, and that doesn't sit well with me. So Ivy found me from a post of mine on Instagram as well and reached out, and so it was really exciting for me to be able to have a conversation with people who do care, and wanted to have a tough conversation. So
hi, I'm Daniel. I'm from Lübeck in northern Germany. I was born in Lübeck and lived all my life here, so I haven't seen much of the world yet. As far as I know, my family is completely German. Most exotic goes to Iceland, and I hope to hear and see what others think about the whole topic, and if my views on it are correct, or if I have to adjust them to understand better why people are feeling hurt and what can be done to help them.
So the first question is, what does the Black Lives Matter movement mean to you? Do you support it? If yes, how do you show support?
Okay. Well, to me, what the Black Lives Movement stands for, I mean, obviously it's in the title. It's, you know, saying that Black Lives Matter, but it's more than matter, in my opinion. It is more about injustice And unfortunately, it is predominantly Black people that are suffering injustices. But I think it's all injustices, because here in California, we had an El Salvadorian kid got shot by police, and Black Lives Matter showed up for it. And they were like, we're not having this. Vanessa Guillen was a US soldier who was murdered on base, and Black Lives Matter showed up for it, and they were fighting for it. So to me, it's more than just talking about, you know, Black kids and Black men and Black women who've gotten shot by white supremacists and police officers. It's about injustices and people deserving justice. And they always, the movement always shows up, and the supporters always shows up every time that there is an injustice. Sometimes they show up more for others, but it seems that it's just about injustice. So in my opinion, that's what it means to me. And I do support it. I've gone to many protests. I support Black-owned businesses. I'm talking to my racist white family, which is very exhausting. But you know, I'm not trying to like say it's more exhausting than being a Black person in America, because I know it's not, but it's exhausting. And I'm reading books about being anti-racist, and also just about Black joy, which I think is really important. I think it's an element that gets forgotten in these conversations, is like the entire existence of being a Black person is not about the way that they've suffered. It's about the beauty of being a Black person. And I think supporting Black Lives Matter is supporting all of the wonderful things that their Black lives are contributing to our society. I also live here in Long Beach, and on my window I had a huge sign painted for the longest, but you know, things get dirty here, so I had to clean it. And I'm thinking of painting a new one, but I haven't decided what I'm gonna put. But I think it was one of those things that in my neighborhood in particular, there's a lot of signs up, for one. I think people just felt like, yes, like there's more people here supporting us than there are against us. And I think that that's an important aspect of community.
It's interesting what Sofia said, because actually when the George Floyd video surfaced, and everything kind of became very heated worldwide and everybody was jumping in on the conversation, I made a couple of posts and I was very vocal on social media. And then a friend of mine from the States reached out, and then he started kind of spewing statistics to me about police brutality across the board. It was essentially a kind of all lives matter kind of pitch. Police brutality is the problem, it's not racism is the problem. So I'm currently finding it really interesting how, because the Black Lives Matter movement is in danger of getting kind of dispersed. All these issues intersect somewhere, but they all need kind of focusing separately as well. And there's a lot of problems in the UK right now with kind of anti-Semitism has been kind of weaponized again in politics. But Sophia's right, it does seem like the Black Lives Matter movement does seem to be like this core group of young people who are just very open to injustice across the board. It has to move in some direction where all these things are given equal value, but I don't know, that kind of damaged that relationship that I had with my friend in the States, because it was like he wanted to dismiss racism and just talk about police brutality, which is obviously a problem in the States.
Yeah, it's hard to look at somebody the same way when they come at you with these like statistics that they just pulled off of a Google chart, and you're just like, first of all, did you fact check any of this, or did you just pull it off of some right-wing pundit site that is feeding into their rhetoric? Because even if the issue is police brutality, which no one's debating, who is it happening to the most? Let's be real. So
well, he was trying to argue that it happens like equally, and it's about poverty, and at some point I had to say, well, I don't have the statistics, but all I can do is listen to what Black and brown people are saying about their experience in the world.
Yeah.
So I definitely agree with what Sofia is saying. Like, it definitely stands for all of injustice. But I think that when we say that, I think we need to be careful, because we can redirect the origin of why Black Lives Matter started. I went to the University of Missouri, which is right outside of Ferguson, which is where the Ferguson protest happened after Mike Brown was killed by police brutality. And the speakers were on my campus, and we listened to them talk. And it is very much about Black lives, racism, and systematic racism within the United States. Not saying that things don't intersect and boil over into other parts, as what Sam was saying. Like, there's definitely a lot of intersection, and there's a lot of things that mix together. But, and like, while Black Lives Matter, of course, stands for, at least I think it does stand for equality and racial justice and everything. But I think that until we can really focus on Black people and really understand, the injustices that they face within the I have to say this within the United States because that's my scope and that's my perspective. And again, like I'm on this call because like I'm not sure about how this all relates within like the UK or in Germany. But I think at least in the US, we can't move on and fix a lot of problems until we can straight up be like, Black Lives Matter. And we're saying this because our judicial system and our government clearly shows through action that they don't believe that.
Definitely.
Black Lives Matter is pretty important because it's a movement that demands justice like other movements. But I think especially with Black Lives Matter, what's important is that racism is so deeply rooted, especially in European history, and we kind of ignore it. European history is about that we try to conquer the whole world with theory of races, and somehow this is not properly addressed in our school system. Our history lessons still are pretty whitewashed when I think about it. We never really criticize methods and colonization, and even though we are the people here living in Europe, everything around us, our wealth, our privileges, that we are economically so extremely powerful is rooted in this history, and that we do not talk about it. I see in Black Lives Matter is putting a huge focus on this topic, which we actually really needed already a long time ago.
The history part of it is really important because I think in the UK, especially, to me, Black Matter seems like it's about exposing, like the systemic racism that's oppressing those of color in order to raise whiteness and like white supremacy. And it's like, it is a denial of that history because like, say with those, there's been loads of petitions about changing the curriculum in the UK to like teach about our colonial history, which I think would really impact the way people saw how history affects where we are today and how we have our privilege as a result of it, and how racism is just a thing in order to justify dehumanizing people in order to oppress and exploit them. In response to the petitions, the government have just said, oh no, we already teach that. And it's like, even though you've had thousands and thousands and thousands of people saying, we didn't learn about this, what the fuck? Sorry, excuse me.
I have a question for you. Do you think that if people in the UK were to learn about the realities of the history of the country and its people and colonialism and conquering and all that, it would make people feel less pride in their country? Because I think that's why we do it here in the US. They don't want us to know the darkness of our country, because if we did, then why would we care about it?
Yeah, I totally agree, because a lot of the more overt movements here of like the really racist ones that are just like so outwardly horrendous, they all stand behind patriocy, and so unless people were patriotic, like we shouldn't be patriotic. Like if you are patriotic, then you're basically just denying all the atrocities that led to today.
Like where I've gotten to recently is just understanding how like capitalism and racism meet, because it's the differences between people has been weaponized for hundreds of years, and of course we all have to grow up doing whatever we're doing, as normal people going about our business. But it's been very deliberate, and it feels like it's still very deliberate to kind of keep the status quo, because white centers of power at the top with all the money and all the ownership, they're not going to give it up easily. So it's like, to me, it goes hand in hand with capitalism. That's kind of where I'm at with it right now. Like the whole thing feels like it needs to come down to be rebuilt, I don't know how you do that without a lot of pain and destruction. But
when I was in school and we were learning about history and Christopher Columbus, it's almost glorified, we're conquerors. I don't know how the education system is now because it was a long time ago, but I don't see a conversation happening or questions being raised by parents who are my age now. However, more importantly, my view is that what needs to be taught is race education, and this is what's happening now. So the conversation of the stories that are happening to people in history and now, because it continues. Talking to my close Black friends, hearing stories, stories that are coming up now that weren't coming up before, because they've been so used to this happening to them throughout their lives, they just learn to be strong and ignore it. And that isn't right. And that's what needs to be come to the forefront for people to understand and for people to learn. Because if these stories aren't told and if this isn't being shown, how are people going to know?
A lot of people call white privilege and like the luxury, if you will, to ignore the feelings that are associated with mistreatment and with injustice. As white people, we can kind of mosey on during our day without feeling the pain that exists in the community that is so heavily targeted. So when you hear about white people being given most of the money and having all this pride and being wealthy and ignoring so much, what we're really talking about is dehumanizing our souls and our emotion and losing that aspect of humanity. And that's happening to those who are quote unquote having that luxury, right? And that's completely taking away our ability to relate to human beings, which then turns us into sheep and turns us into people who can't think about things that are emotional. For me personally, with my friends group and with my family, I feel things very deeply and I try very hard to put myself in the shoes of people who are going through something hard. And that's something that so many people refuse to do, therefore refuse to relate to those who are going through it, and then can very easily ignore it because they don't want to feel that pain. And even though it's empathy and it's not an actual feeling, we're not actually going through it, that gives you the ability to then push you towards change and push you towards those conversations that are hard. And white people, again, I put luxury in quotes because it's not a luxury. It's terrifying and it's so sad, but people consider it to be a luxury. And people meaning like ourselves, because they don't want to feel the pain of what other people experience. And you see it every day by past people who are homeless on the street without batting an eye, because you don't want to feel the pain of what they're feeling. And so that turns us into a numb robot with no ability to feel or feel the need to change anything, which I think is utterly horrendous. But I think it's opening our eyes to feeling again as human beings, and having the white community, which is such a freaking huge, disgusting, overwhelming group of people because we're killing off so many, giving us the ability to feel again, and not giving it. We need to work for that. It's sad that we've gotten away from that for so long, but I think that this is going to be opening our eyes, and I hope to see people open their eyes and open their hearts to being able to feel for the human race.
I don't know if it's like this in other parts of the world, but I think that there's like this weird thing that here in the United States, particularly, especially in Los Angeles, that people do, that is like, they're proud that they're not empathetic. They have like a pride in the fact that they only care about themselves and me first. And they're like, yeah, I just, I put myself first and I put my family first and everyone else, I'd kill them if I had to. And it's like, where did this attitude come from? And I don't know if it's like that anywhere else.
On that, I feel like that's toxic masculinity, especially here in the United States. Not that it's all men, but I feel like women are so often the first ones to be empathetic and sympathetic. Here in the US, we see men, young boys, like are told not to cry, to not show any sort of emotion, that the only emotions that they can show is like if you're conquering a woman, if you're conquering another man, or if you're angry. Often when we have conversations about race or about immigration or different things like that, is so many women will be the first ones to say, you wouldn't cross the desert to give your child a better life. And men are like, I don't even know what that means, because they just can't get that for some reason. And I feel like that's clearly a sign of toxic masculinity, especially here in the US.
In the UK, we're like definitely, it's constantly swinging between like the American system, so heavily capitalist, I think, makes that thing more pronounced. It's like you get what you can get for you and your small group around you, and you don't look out for the bigger community, and that's encouraged in the culture. In Europe, there's still socialism in a lot of countries in Europe, and it's more about the collective. It's taxes are higher, but public services are better. In the UK, it swings in both ways, from almost from generation to generation, or kind of depending which party comes in. Right now, it feels like we're swinging more toward a very heavily capitalist kind of selfish, and you can see it. People are becoming more self. There's a lot of fear about immigration, and yeah, it's always stupid white men at the forefront pushing these ideas. We need a matriarchy, really. You know, I don't know. It's messed up. It's a mess.
Many of the most successful nations were matriarchies.
There you go.
I totally agree. And I think because women often are the first to be empathetic and sympathetic, the capitalist system that we're in sort of rewards the selfish. So therefore, it's like that just aids to the disparities in power, I think.
I think there's certainly a bigger divide. You see more of a fight now between both sides. And I think it's very generational. A lot of people from maybe like 50 years upwards, as opposed to people younger. A lot of people that I know that seem to be a lot more forward thinking, a lot more open. The conversations they're having with their children, they're asking their children more questions. Their children are asking more questions. Conversations are being had. There's a bigger openness, especially with younger, really young children. And then on Fridays in our schools now, you have book day. So you can go as any character from any story, and you can dress as anything you want. There's boys going to school as princesses. There's girls going to school as Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk. There is no toleration for any kind of discrimination there. And the parents, the ones that I know, you know, they're going full force with this. So I do think it's very generational, though. But you do see a lot more of a fight now between those ideas and classes.
Why do you think that some white people have an issue with the Black Lives Matter movement or with the Black community?
I think some white people have a problem with the Black Lives Matter movement because white people aren't used to being othered. We're very much used to being included all the time with absolutely no exclusion ever. So I think when somebody, or when there's a movement that's basically sitting like, okay, now it's your turn to like sit down and listen and not be at the center of attention. Like, this isn't about you, you know, like this is, well, it's about everybody, but you know what I mean? Like to help white people sit down and be like, shut up, basically, and listen. I think that a lot of people have a problem with that because they're not used to sitting on the sidelines and letting other people's identity be at the forefront of the conversation.
Yes, this certain aspect with we are not used to othering is pretty important because that's just the reality. We created racism, we divided our society by othering other members of our society, other communities. I think the problem some people also might have with the Black Lives Matter movement, that Black Lives Matter isn't actually about the Black community. It's about them facing an issue white people created. Therefore, certain white people, I don't know how well they realize that, but it is our history and we have to take responsibility. And taking responsibility is always hard for people, especially with issues they cannot really directly solve or even see. Here in Germany, many people always come with the Black Lives Matter, and then they come with, yeah, there's also racism against German people. And I'm like, actually, no, but they just don't want to talk about the issue right now here, because then they suddenly start talk about discrimination. Then I'm like, yeah, but if you are against discrimination, then Black Lives Matter shouldn't be a problem to you. It's just like they don't want to really take responsibility. That's the hardest part.
Yeah, it's this fear of having to do something. Now it's your turn. You have to sit down. You have to listen. You have to understand. And you have to empathize. They just, you know, when you're not used to doing that, you don't want to do it. And I think the only way, like Hillary was saying earlier, the message has to be put out there. The stories have to be put out there in order for people to empathize, because if you can't empathize, you're not going.
Definitely. I think being othered is a huge part of why white people have a problem with Black Lives Matter. But I also think that accepting the movement Black Lives Matter and that racism towards Black people exists when you're not experiencing it requires a certain level of like emotional depth that a lot of privileged people haven't been required to do. Like they don't even have those skills because they haven't needed it. Not necessarily because they're white, or not because their life has been so great, because obviously we know that being white doesn't mean your life has been perfect, but it's for that specific topic, they haven't needed to face those demons within themselves. And to sit here and say like, yes, Black Lives Matter, and I've been complacent, means that you had to kind of like look within And I think that that's something that's really uncomfortable, and people don't like doing that. And until they've done that, it's really hard for people to accept something that others them, that makes them feel like they're not a part of the narrative.
I think a lot of it comes from the wording of white privilege. I think a lot of people just look at their lives and they go, well, my life is hard as well. Yes, Black Lives Matter, but white lives matter as well. My life matters. And what do you mean I'm privileged? And it almost, for a lot of people, explaining more, we're not talking about financial privilege. We're just talking about the fact that one of the privileges that you have is that you don't have to deal with being treated in a certain way because of the color of your skin. And I think people just misunderstand this white privilege thing. So I think, to me, that's what I've heard from people who have a problem with the Black Lives Matter movement, because everybody's life is hard and they're just kind of concentrating on themselves. The whole world population needs to increase their levels of empathy.
Empathy definitely is important, but racism is such a huge topic and such a huge construct. Emotional empathy is not going to solve everything. And I think by the school system not requiring the needed education for the topic, it can also be pretty exhausting, or you don't actually know where to start when you want to educate yourself about such a huge part of history. Therefore, I think emotional empathy needed, definitely. But on the other hand, when you don't know certain things, you cannot make up your mind how the people back then tried to create their own world, their perfect society, their perfect white society. You need background knowledge. And here in Germany, where we have like lots of taxes, overall, we don't have to worry about affording healthcare, but still, it's always also about dividing. And when it's not racism, then it's classism, and classism directed to poor people. And therefore, people just don't want to hear you had it easy. And privilege sounds like that. But once people understand it, I hope this will change this whole how we talk about privilege.
I think there's also a pride issue that goes along with it, is that a lot of white people perceive Black Lives Matter as a Black pride movement because of what white pride has done throughout history, that they get scared when any other race or orientation or anything starts showing any sort of pride, is they feel like, oh, I'm going to be under attack now. White pride has killed millions of Jewish people, millions of Black people, has conquered nations, has done all of these things. So when someone starts to show Black pride or Mexican pride or any other sort of pride, they are like, oh my gosh, I'm white. These people are coming for me. I think marriage equality, especially in the US, was a great show of that as well. I remember when marriage equality was passed, I was in Colorado with a bunch of redneck white people. And a woman came up to me and was like, oh, you're excited about marriage equality being passed? And I was like, oh yes, like now my sister can finally get married. Like this is very exciting. And she goes, well, the rainbow kids are gonna try to take away marriage from straights now. And just like a perfect example of someone else is showing pride, but that doesn't mean they're taking away from you. That's not what this is. And you hear a lot of white people now, often white men. I'll use Beyonce's Black is King, for example. If you went through the comment section on that, there were a lot of people like, I can't say white is king, so why are they allowed to say Black is king? And it's just like very fearful of what someone else showing pride looks like.
The media, how they've also chosen to demonize as well as the races, but also the movement, in order to get those closeted people, to give them a scapegoat and to divide the classes and turn everyone against each other, because then divide and conquer makes everybody weaker.
I've heard the word white privilege been tossed around a lot of times. Do you believe in white privilege, and what does it actually mean to you?
Being a half Arab, half white person in the United States is kind of like complicated, because some people see you as white and then some people don't. I look a lot more white than my brother, and we have the same exact parents, but he looks super Arab. Like the amount of discrimination that he has faced versus what I have faced, simply because I look a little bit whiter than him, is severe. It must exist. It's purely because I look a little bit whiter than him, and he has been stopped by police. He's been harassed in schools. He's been harassed at jobs. It must exist because I've experienced it. And I feel like people have a hard time accepting that they've even experienced privilege. I've never been profiled by the police ever in my life because I don't look threatening in their gaze, even though they probably should have stopped me a time or two when I was a dumbass kid. You know what I mean? Like, I even did something stupid. I was shoplifting in high school. My Black friend was shoplifting in high school. She has a mugshot and I don't. So, like, let's be real. It exists. And I think that people have a hard time figuring out those little things that have happened to them in their life to point to the privilege of being white, or like, I hate the word white passing, but I guess I'll use it. I don't like the term though.
Yeah, I definitely know for a fact that white privilege exists. I don't know if it's really like up for debate anymore, really. But it just means that systematically our society benefits white people more so than Black people and people of color. I knew this ever since I was a kid, and I would test what I could get away with. I've been racially profiled. If anything, I, on a subconscious level, when I was a kid, knew that I could get away with more than other people based on what I look like. Now, as I've expanded my education, I know that that word is called white privilege. Yeah, I've definitely benefited from that in my life. I don't think it's to say, when I posted about white privilege, I had a lot of people, it opens up a conversation, right? Because people, again, are saying that, I've struggled, I've done this. And it's not to say that white people don't struggle. It's just reiterating that you don't experience racial discrimination. And I had somebody comment on one of my posts asking, how do I get rid of white privilege? And I think that having that standpoint is very interesting. Obviously, it's not something that you can necessarily get rid of because it exists on a systematic level. I think that awareness is key, and once we all start recognizing that as a white person we get treated differently in different realms of society, then you can stand up against those injustices.
I think here in Germany, racism shows the most when people really ask very, very hard, where are you from? And this is a question you can ask the people here, because in the US, it's like people came here, they were colonizers. Yes, but here in Germany, when you don't fit into this white image of our society, people immediately ask you, where are you from? And when they say, yeah, I am from this in the city, and then you're like, no, where are you originally from? And I think this is completely wrong, because I am a foreigner like many other people, and no one has ever asked me where I am from, because they all consider me German. And when I say, well, but I'm actually not German, they're pretty surprised. And this is where what a Black person or any other person of color doesn't experience. They can try as hard as they can speak German as well as they want, and people will still ask them, where are you from? Because this othering in our society still is so present and so strong.
My friends have told me, this is like experiences that people have told me that they'll ask of where their family's from or where they're from. And if they're like literally American, their parents were born in the US, but because they're not white, they'll ask like where they're from. They won't trying to instead of accepting that this person is American and they're not white, they're trying to exactly like figure out where their heritage is from, and like that's the identity that they have, as opposed to being American even if they were born here.
I have a lot of experience with that because I am apparently ethnically ambiguous, which is a fun term. But people ask me all the time where I'm from. I always say California because I'm very Californian, and they're like, no, like, where are you from? I'm like, California. And then they'll be like, yeah, but like, where's your parents from? I'm like, the United States, even though my dad's not, but I know what they're getting at, and I want them to ask the question properly. Ask me what my ethnicity is, or where my genetic ancestral background is, and then give me $5 because I'm sick of answering the question.
It's that thing about white people centering themselves all the time. It's always like, this is the norm, we center ourselves, and then you're the other. Even you might be American, but like, where are you really from? It's so frustrating. It's deeply frustrating.
I think the point to white people censoring themselves is like a very important point, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, especially the American girls in here, but like, I think in the United States, we've only started calling black people, and maybe in the last 5 years, maybe 10 years. But for the longest time it was African American. And enough black people were like, we're not all from Africa. Some of us are from Haiti or from the Caribbean, or there's Afro-Latinas. Like, it's okay to say black. And I think a lot of white people were like, are you, so you're black? And it's like, yeah, I'm black. Like, it's okay. It's not offensive.
Hillary?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to respond to the original question of white privilege and relate back to what Shelby's answer was of constantly testing what that looks like to be a white female and somebody who I've been told over and over and over again that I look innocent. I hated that comment for a really long time because it's just my face and the way that I was born. It doesn't mean that your heart says something in particular. And so I tried testing that for a really long time. And I had a long conversation with my grandma the other day because she was having a very difficult time understanding what's going on right now and putting herself into a place of vulnerability and actually opening herself up to understanding. And so one of the examples that I had to give her for my grandma personally, like that, the way that she relates to things is it has to relate to her. She has to be able to feel it. And so I had to use some pretty brutal examples for her to understand what's going on. But one of the most simple examples that I gave her was I live across the street from Vons grocery store. It's a chain of grocery stores for those who are not from here. Because I live across the street from one, ran out of food the other day, went there, grabbed it. I never take a receipt I never take a bag, when it's a small load because it literally is my neighbor. So I just walked out with my groceries. I threw my receipt away in the self-checkout aisle and walked out with a handful of groceries and a backpack. And that was it. I had my hands full of food. And I didn't get stopped. The security guard looked at me and nodded his head, and then I went through the doors. And to me, that says a lot. When I was in my youth, I also shoplifted a lot. And I could have very easily have gotten away with it the same way that I did with my groceries the other day. And that is extraordinarily unfair. But I had to put it in perspective for my grandma. My partner is Black, and I've constantly surrounded myself with people who are a very diverse friends group. And I get examples over and over and over again of how easy we have it as a white community. But for my partner, for example, had to give up his car because he had a nicer car when he moved to the States and got pulled over and over and over again because he didn't quote unquote look like he owned that car. I didn't look like that was his car. Why do you have a nice car? You're Black and you shouldn't have that. And that is racial profiling. That is completely unfair when, that doesn't happen to anybody else. I'm extraordinarily poor. I have a decent car. Why should I have that car? Why should I be able to walk out of a grocery store with my hands full and no proof that I bought this thing? That to me is the tiniest example of the way that white privilege is so abundant, and it takes place in the tiniest actions in a person's life. As a white person, as a Black person, that act of walking out of a grocery store with your hands full of food without the proof that you purchased it is probably terrifying. And that would not happen, and so that was just something I wanted to relate back to with what Shelby was saying, and is I have to do the same thing, or I don't have to, but I want to do the same thing to prove a point that it is something that exists on a daily basis and when we're not even thinking about it.
I would love to see that kind of higher up echelons of society, really. I mean, we all grew up just watching white men in positions of power talk with authority. I don't know if some of those people were prepared to give up their position. I mean, Serena Williams' husband gave up his position in Reddit, insisting that he was replaced by a person of color. And somehow, because it's just so heavily weighted at the top with white men, either it needs to be taken from them or they need to realize and redress the balance themselves, Little old me. I mean, the power that I have is just in those kind of everyday situations, I guess. But I'm constantly trying to think about, like, when that comes up and I realize that I've been favored or not, or I can see an injustice, it's like that. I guess that's our responsibility as white people to kind of point that out.
That's interesting, because how do you get people to give up their place in society? How do you obstruct a very white male dominated structure that kind of takes over almost all realms of our lives? And then how do you say, like, you actually need to step down, or like you need to uplift somebody of a different identity to take on your position? Like, I think us talking about it on a level individually in our lives is one thing, but to really like dismantle the problem on a systematic level, how do you actually infiltrate that? How do you create that kind of solution?
To me, it feels like it's going to be a real fight, and that it's a fight that needs to happen to dismantle the patriarchy and systemic racism worldwide. I mean, powerful white men are not just going to go, oh, you know what, you're right, this is imbalanced. I'm just going to give up my CEOs to redress the balance. It feels like a big fight. I mean, it from what I can see, because I wanted to ask you guys, the Americans, like from afar, it looks terrifying what's happening in the States.
It is.
I was talking to one of my clients the other day, and in her business, they, in the in the application process to begin with, they are taking away the person's name. They do not know their ethnicity, and they're taking away where they studied. So you see the qualifications, you see their experiences. And then further down the line, you get telephone conversation as you get to talk to the person more. And then you get then you get an interview. And at the interview stage, on the one-to-one interview, you get their name, you get their age, and you get their details. So anyone that is coming into the position or applying for the position, the people who are getting selected, they cannot be profiled. They can only be profiled from their experiences and their achievements. And I think this is a very powerful way of moving forward and being able to help get rid of this structure in the way it is now.
Been talking with individuals about that exact topic of those checkboxes coming up and identifying yourself as that person and as that race, which obviously does lift your application or whatever it is up to the surface and to the top of the list, if you will. Also, the fact that you have to state your race or the person you're calling about's race when you call the police department. Who are you calling on? And that is such an unfair, unless you're literally trying to give a description of somebody. If something horrifying is happening, then sure, of course, give a description of somebody so that they know who to talk to. But any other reasoning, there is no reason to identify somebody's race, really somebody's gender or your age group for anything to make it a fair qualification or a fair approach to something. And that's kind of something that I've been discussing with people and kind of how we can go about raising that awareness that that's something that needs to be taken away in order to allow fairness in some areas of society. And how can we actually go about making that change, whether that be petitions or just talking and raising the awareness of that topic in general. But it's something that I personally experienced in applying for a position at my work recently, or applying for a promotion. I ended up withdrawing from that because I knew the group of people who were applying, and I actually wanted to voluntarily withdraw myself as a white female. We're actually raising, like, my company is predominantly white female run now, which is a beautiful thing, but it's predominantly white. So for me personally, wanted to withdraw from that possibility of who could then be promoted. But I ran into it then, and ran into it in a phone call that I made to a hospital the other. Just so many different areas that you see that it's so normalized now to specify your race, your age, and your gender, where that can be very easily broken down if people can understand why that causes so much more unfairness.
I know in the past, like my ex-boyfriend was Black, and there was one time we were walking down the street in Los Angeles, and a cop like pulled up on the sidewalk in front of us, told my boyfriend to get on the ground because a Black man had stolen a car in the area. And I kept screaming at the police, like, if we stole a car, wouldn't we be in that car right now? Like, why are we walking down the street if we just stole a car? And my boyfriend at the time like kept yelling at me to shut up and all these things. And afterwards, like, I was talking to him and I was like, why are you getting mad at me? And he was like, because the cops are never going to pull a gun on you. Even if you're the one yelling at the cops, they're still going to point the gun at me. And I was 19 years old when that happened. And that was very much like a moment of like, oh shit, like this is beyond what, like, racism is beyond what I can comprehend. Obviously now that's changed, but at the time it was just a very shocking thing. I will say, on white privilege, I don't think that there's any, even white people that are saying like, I don't believe in this isn't real, I've had a hard life, all these things like that. I think they just don't want to dismantle white privilege, because I think without their white privilege, they're going to realize that they're just a mediocre person. And no one wants to have that realization, especially in America. I feel like there's very much this whole thing on like, everyone is special, everyone's wonderful, everyone contributes, especially like white men. But I think that if they have to confront their mediocrity, that's the problem with dismantling white privilege.
I just wanted to kind of join the dots between what we were talking about education as well, because it has to happen at the top, but it has to happen in the foundations as well, because like all these things you're talking about interview techniques, and that's great, but like for somebody to actually get to the point where they can apply for a certain job, they need certain qualifications, which means presupposes they went to a certain college, presupposes that they had a certain school education. So it's like at the top, white men with power need to give up some of their power. And then in the foundation, like we need to restructure the education so it is fair, from everybody gets what they need from the ground up, you know?
Yeah.
It's completely systemic.
I have a problem with this language being used of like white people need to give up their power, because I mean, I think that white people don't need to give up their power. There's room for everybody at the top. They just need to start letting in people of color, Black people, Asian people, Hispanic people. They need to start to realize their worth so that they can sit at the same table. It's not like we're going to get rid of these white people's power so that a new race can take power. We all need to be able to sit at the same table. That way that we actually can achieve true equality for everybody. Because if we don't have that, then what's the point of all of this?
No,
And
I agree,
yeah.
absolutely agree. I just, I guess when I picture it, I specifically picture the UK Parliament and the House of Lords and those very concentrated positions of power that are 99% white men.
Yeah.
And obviously, I'm not arguing that that it needs completely replacing. It's just that somehow has to be broken up, because those people all went to school together. They're all married to each other. They all socialize with each other. And it's almost like a closed network, basically.
Yeah, the people at the top keep moving further up.
Yeah.
But I think that once the people at the top, predominantly white males, realize that there is value in having Black voices on your team, Hispanic voices, female voices, LGBTQ voices on your team, and there is value in that, and it makes you more valuable as a whole, then everybody can have a seat at the table.
But is it valuable to those people? Because for people to become that wealthy and that powerful means that somebody has to be poor and taken advantage of. That's where where the capitalist thing comes in. It's like,
absolutely,
it's designed like that deliberately.
I think that individualism has definitely created a fear in inclusivity. So if you just are solely thinking about yourself and not thinking about your country or society as a whole and what's beneficial for them, then actually making everything inclusive and you recognizing that your place in society is inherently exclusive, like going about changing that, I think brings a lot of fear, because it's like, it's unknown what's going to happen to me. Also, white privilege is definitely, Jane Elliott did a video, I think like back in the 90s or something, which is still incredibly relevant, obviously. But she's an anti-racism educator, and white privilege definitely exists on a subconscious level, because she was in this auditorium full of white people, and she was like, stand up if you would be willing to trade your place in society with a Black person. And then like nobody stands up, and she's like, no, I don't think that you understood me. Like, stand up if you would like to trade your place in society. It like reiterates it again, nobody stands up. So even if you're not going to admit straight up that you get treated better in society than Black people or people of color, just not willing to stand up and be like, yeah, I'll trade my spot, it like recognizes that you know your advantages on a subconscious level, regardless if you're going to actually admit it or not. I would recommend checking it out. It's a really good video.
That was a phenomenal video. It was so palpable what everybody's feelings and emotions were when she asked that question. It got so awkward and so uncomfortable because they knew exactly what they were doing by saying no.
So the next question I have is, do you believe racism against white people exists? Is that a thing?
No.
Oh.
No?
The definition of racism is that it involves an oppression.
But why do you feel like some white people feel like they are being racist again amongst themselves, or they're experiencing racism as well?
Because they're delusional. Sorry, go ahead.
All right, who wants to jump in?
I feel like it's a tricky one, because although it can you can be approached as you being a target of racism. It's actually as a result of racism itself. So the only reason it's happening is the result of racism.
Racism is discrimination where power is also involved. Power is extremely important when you talk about racism as an issue. Of course, white people can be discriminated, white people can face prejudice, but they will never deal with discrimination on a systemic level. At least these white people that created this systemic issue. Yes, you can. I mean, being black and being white. This is like political. These are like political terms. If you are marked as a white person in our society, that also means you don't experience racism. If you experience xenophobia, I mean, racism took extremely fanatic levels when they tried to, I don't know, create races for everything, for people wearing glasses, being poor. Of course, then there also was some sort of racism against white people, but this is not the racism we talk about today, and this is not the racism that is impacting other people in our society anymore. And therefore, I think this whole topic about is there racism against white people is just like an excuse to, again, avoid taking responsibility and just face you are living in a position you have to worry about certain aspects in your everyday life.
Yes, you can be prejudiced to a white person, but it's not going to affect their position in society, like socially, economically, politically. So it's not anywhere near the same, and there's no deep set history and trauma to go with it. So like, if say you called someone like a white trash, or like, which is an example someone used trying to say, oh well, I've experienced racism, and then it was like, well, that's not loaded, it doesn't have any kind of deep emotional impact, so it's empty.
Yeah, I mean, the way I understand it is that it's a system as opposed to like individual kind of bigotry. It's the same as any ism, you know, capitalism or communism or feminism. It's racism. It's systemic. That's how I understand it. And in that way, like there is no system of oppression against white people, and there never has been. So it doesn't exist. What, you know, anti-white racism.
What Patrick was saying really sums it up, because there is definitely a difference between discrimination, prejudice, and racism. And I think in the conversation, we definitely lump them all together. But I'm currently reading White Fragility right now, highly recommend. And she really dives into racism on being a systematic level of oppression. So racism affects if you can get a job or where you live, or if you have a higher probability of being arrested or experiencing police brutality, which is something that white people don't necessarily experience. Sam pointed out earlier that there's definitely financial privilege, which I think you can be denied housing on a financial level for sure. But as far as racism goes, I don't think that it's possible for white people to experience oppression in a system and a society that upholds whiteness. White people just don't really experience oppression on a systematic level, but white people definitely experience discrimination and prejudice, but racism, no, I don't think. I think whenever we talk about racism, we talk about as if like all of this is really in the past, that it happened a really long time ago, when the woman who was responsible for Emmett Till's death is still alive. Ruby, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting her last name, who was the first Black girl to be integrated into schools. She's still alive today. You know, in the context of Europe, you know, having like World War II and anti-Semitism, that was, you know, less than 100 years ago. So this is the racism that has been embedded in our society through history. Didn't happen that long ago. So I think a lot of people want to move on and be like, oh, this was so long ago, when there's people who are still alive today who are directly responsible for the racism that exists currently.